Hey, this is Mr. Burns. I'm going to start another video lesson here. So let me click this button and then let me go down here and click this view, and there you should see the next person that we're going to learn about is Dorothy Day, and she lived from 1897 to 1980. So she had quite a long life. She is also a pioneer in the fight for women's rights. She was concerned about workers. She wanted shorter hours, better pay, and safer jobs. And early on in her life, working in a factory or a mine was a very dangerous place. You worked long hours. The machinery was often pretty crude and you could get injured by it. There were lots of children working in America's factories and mines, so this was an important thing. She was also a pioneer in the fight for women's rights. As a young woman, she was not able to vote because that right had not been extended to women yet. So two really interesting things about Dorothy Day is that she was a believer in women's rights, and she had a strong focus on the poor in America. She thought that as a young woman, she was living during the Great Depression, and she could see that our society was very unjust in that wealth was accumulating amongst the rich and the poor had very little. Alright, so let's continue. This is a picture of her in later life. Dorothy Day was educated and she went into journalism, and she founded the Catholic Worker Movement. And so the Catholic Worker Movement also had a newspaper called the Catholic Worker, and journalism was a very important way that people got their information in the 1920s and the 1930s and the 1940s. Radio was just coming on in that time, and there was no television whatsoever. So most people who got their news got it from the newspapers. As I said before, Dorothy Day was also an advocate for women having the right to vote, and she was actually arrested protesting in front of the White House in 1917. So one of the changes that would take place is that American women would earn the right to vote in 1920. So sometimes you might see a special word that goes along with that, and the word is suffrage. So again, just reviewing this slide, she wanted to see a fair distribution of wealth in America, and she had a focus on not only women but also the poorest Americans. So here's a picture of her newspaper, the Catholic Worker, and she was a journalist, and I said before, journalism was very important in the 1920s, the 1930s, and the 1940s because this is how people got their information. So she was a very intelligent person, and she was well-spoken, and she knew how to write. So her message reached a lot of people. Early in her life, she had a very chaotic relationship with men, and this is what kind of makes her a controversial person. She probably had numerous affairs. One of her affairs ended up in a pregnancy, and it was a very unhealthy relationship, and she had an abortion. So she terminated her pregnancy. In those days, this was a very dangerous thing to do because abortions were illegal in almost all the states, and a woman could very easily die getting one of these. She also, because of these problems that she had with men in her life, would attempt suicide. Later on, she would become a Catholic. So despite the controversy because of her chaotic relationships with men, Dorothy Day had another passion, and it was another thing that lasts to this day and age. She worked for social justice, and she started these Dorothy Day centers, which are in many American cities, and they work with our nation's urban poor. The picture that you see behind my handsome face is a picture of the new Dorothy Day Center in St. Paul, And again, the Dorothy Day Centers are all about social justice. These Dorothy Day Centers are a place where people can get a meal. If they are homeless, they can get a place to sleep for the night. Gets the poor off the streets during our cold seasons. There is some help for people with substance abuse and also mental illness. The Catholic Church is currently studying whether or not she should be considered for sainthood. So, this is another area where Dorothy Day was an important person. There's another picture of a Dorothy Day Centers. They are still operating in many American cities. There are 200 of them at the time I was doing this research, and they provide shelter and meals. There's some access to medical care and mental health support. So she was a very important person. She was a pioneer in many respects. She was involved in the women's fight to get the vote. She wanted to see America treat its poor well, and so she was an advocate for social justice. Alright, you can watch this video several times until you get the gist of what Dorothy Day is all about.